Hello, I'm Scott Fry, and today I'm going to provide a brief overview of our Nagios automation project, whose goal was to automate the build of the infrastructure and the configuration of the Nagios server using Ansible and our standard Ansible inventory to create the whole monitoring solution. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the prerequisites used for this demonstration to replicate our production hardware. So in this instance, I'm going to use three Ubuntu 22 virtual machines. I've got one acting as the Nagios server itself, one acting as a typical Adoptium build server, and another one configured and set up as an Adoptium test server. As opposed to our production infrastructure, which is all set up using Ansible, we have a dedicated Ansible controller machine because these are VMs and in an isolated environment, because I don't want to jeopardize our production environment or interfere with it in its normal work. These are the steps I've taken on these machines that are handled by the normal playbooks and build of the machines. So for all of the VMs, I've enabled the root account for SSH. The firewall rules have been updated on all of the machines to allow SSH between them. On the Nagios server, I've created a new SSH key and deployed that to the servers so that the Nagios server can connect to both the build and the test server. This happens in production using Bastillion and again the normal Ansible playbooks. So I've also, on the Nagios server, which is going to be doubling as our Ansible controller for today, cloned the GitHub Adoptium infrastructure repo, and I've updated the standard inventory.yaml to be configured for these two virtual machines. I'll show that in it shortly. And then finally, the build and the test server have been set up and configured using the normal playbooks. So they're exactly the same as our production infrastructure. So let's move on to the first playbook, which handles the installation of the Nagios server software itself. So we'll switch over to the VM, and as discussed in the prerequisites, I've already cloned the infrastructure repo. I've also then updated the inventory file, moved the old one out of the way and created a new inventory which contains the hosts I'm going to be building. So there's a Ubuntu server, which is Nagios server. There's the build box and the test server there as well. So moving down the playbooks and into the Nagios playbook, and you can see the two main playbooks there. There's a setup server and a configuration server. We'll start with the play setup server. Now, there's plenty of documentation in the GitHub infrastructure repository for this playbook, but the first thing we need to do before running it is configure our Nagios server secret information, which are kept in this secret setup server.enc file, which is an Ansible vault. Now, we ship a unencrypted blank one with the name of the variables and some dummy values. But as you can see there, the Nagios admin password should be set here. The Slack webhook URL should be set there, and then the file encrypted using Ansible Vault. The documentation covers how to do that, but to make this demonstration a little bit speedier, I'm going to remove the kind of default unencrypted one, and I'm going to copy in one of our pre-prepared ones. So I'm going to copy the demo version into that file, and if you look at the encrypted file, you can't see what those values are without knowing the password to decrypt them. So we are going to run the playbook like so, and we will specify the ask vault password parameter so that Ansible can decrypt the vault to get the decrypted versions of those variables. So we'll put the password in and the playbook will run there. So this playbook is going to take a couple of minutes to run through. it's basically installing the Nagios server, all its dependencies, and configuring the web server. It's Apache based. So you can see now it's running through all the tasks, installing all the plugins, configure everything, restarts the Nagios server, and at this point we should have a working Nagios server. So we'll just switch to Firefox. We shall put in the URL for the Nagios server, and we will put in our Nagios admin username and the password from the encrypted vault file. Will not save the password, but you can see here we've got the Nagios server. There's a daemon running. You can see its process ID, which is always a good sign. And if we go and look in host groups, you can literally see the one host, which is the Nagios server, and it successfully started carrying out the checks on itself as you'd expect. So I think that's a resounding success. So moving on to the second part of the demonstration, this is the second of the two Nagios playbooks. This one does the server configuration. So it's going to create all of the Nagios configuration files for those two hosts specified in my temporary inventory.yaml file. So to demonstrate the Nagios configuration playbook, I'm going to run through the configuration process twice. Once with my reduced set of demonstration infrastructure with the infrastructure Nagios server, a build virtual machine and a test virtual machine, just so you can see it create a very small quick set of configuration. And then secondly, I'm going to run it against the full Adoptium infrastructure Ansible inventory, so you can see it create for all of the prescribed hosts in this list. So let's go through how to run the Nagios configure server playbook. So we will switch back over to our Nagios virtual machine. We're still in the playbook's Nagios directory, and before we get started, the first key file is the vars configure server YAML file, which by default has this inventory path, which I've commented out here because that one's pointing to the Adoptium master inventory, and I've swapped that out for my temporary reduced one. So that's that change there. The second really important part is in the roles Nagios config role, and the defaults, which has a collection of settings, which we'll have a look at here, that dictates how the playbook will work. So the first thing of relevance is the Nagios base install path. So if you've changed the default in the Nagios server playbook, or you've got an existing installation, you can adjust that path, and that's where it will write its output files to the standard Nagios paths beneath that. And you can see the official Nagios documentation for how the Nagios server is configured. You can see here that we have Nagios service types, which tells it to look in the inventory and only process those host standards. So we're using build, test, and Docker host. If it doesn't exist, it'll ignore it. If it's build and test, it'll then move on to trying to create the configuration. And finally, the overwrite mode, which dictates whether the config playbook should replace entries for existing servers that are already there. By default, it's set to true. We're doing a clean install. But if you wanted to rerun this playbook to create new configuration for hosts that have been added, then setting the override mode to false would stop it replacing any existing ones, and that's quite a useful feature. And finally, the other key feature in how this works, if we have a look in the files section of this role, there is a Python file and a templates file. The templates directory contains all of the Nagios configuration templates for the combinations of function and operating system. So if we have a look at, say, a build Ubuntu, which is one we're going to create shortly, you can see there it's basically a Nagios server template file that it will populate with all the checks and all the values it needs to behave, and this Python script controls those mappings. So for each combination of function, the build, the test, the Docker host from the earlier variables file, and then an operating system template, so it looks for Windows to match Windows, Mac OS in the full host name to match a Mac, build Ubuntu and test Ubuntu are the two we're going to create in a moment. So those mappings. The other feature that you can do is you can specify an explicit host name. So our Solaris ones have non-standard templates, and you can again map a fully qualified host name to a specific template. And final part is you can exclude some hosts. So these are hosts in the main inventory that are no longer in use and just have historic dummy entries. We don't need to create configuration for those, even though they're included in the build and test groups. So I just list those as excluded hosts there. There's lots of documentation in the GitHub repo on how all of these things work together and how to customize them and adopt them. And as always, you can ask in the Slack channels if you want to have a bit of information about how things work. So moving on now, we will run the configure server playbook against our subset of hosts. So we'll just run that, and again it's a fairly ordinary configure server Ansible playbook. We'll run that. It will now download the inventory file from the URL specified in the variables file, and it will run through and execute all the Python scripts and create all the configuration. If we now have a look under the Nagios installation directory, so most of the Nagios config goes in these directories. We'll have a quick look at the host groups. So you can see there that it's created a VBox host group because the build server is in a host group called VBox, and then it's created a host group called HD2 because the test box is in a different host group called host group 2. So it's created that config file. If we have a look in the server config, there's one config file for each server, and again you can see it's used the template, populated it where it needs to be with IP addresses and host names for both of those servers. There's the test server, So we will switch over to Firefox. We will log into the Nagios UI. So again, you see the servers running, but now when we go to look into the host groups configuration, you can see there that we have our test and build servers in host groups for each of their host groups. We can look in the service groups, and you can see that there's a build server and a test server host group. And we can go and look at that server, and you can see there it's already started monitoring it, and it will run through and perform the checks. So we'll just try and force one of those through to go. So there you go. You can see it's starting to connect and perform all the checks. And that's basically it. That's the configuration created from that inventory. We'll just let those checks run through for a couple of moments. So you can see now, after a short wait, it's running through the services, and you can see most of them are okay there. We've got a warning that this Nagios server needs some package updates, and that there's a issue with JQ not being installed, which is not related to this machine. It's trying to check if there's a Jenkins agent connected, and obviously with this being a demonstration environment, I haven't set up a Jenkins server for it to query. So that's all looking good. So what I'm going to do now is quickly restore this VM and run the configuration playbook against the full server. So as you can see here, our Nagios server is now back to default. The configuration has been removed. All there is left remaining is the Nagios host server itself. So very similar to last time. Just going to check the variables. So vars config server rather. So you can see there it's pointing to the main Adoptium infrastructure. That's fine. So just rerun the playbook, and you can see a much bigger sample set of data. Now this Nagios server isn't configured to connect to the actual production machines. I didn't want to create a temporary key and roll it out to all the machines in a demonstration environment. So now the playbook has completed, we can go and have a look in the config files directory. So look at the host groups config, and you can see there's lots more configuration in there. If we look in the servers directory, there's a lot more config in there for the build, the test, and the Docker host things. And then we switch to Firefox. We log into the Nagios front end. And if we look at the services, again, you can see there's lots of data in there. The host groups are done by infrastructure provider. I'll just zoom that out. Might be a little small, but you can see all the different host groups with the hosts in. Some of the public infrastructure will be able to ping, but it won't be able to SSH in to run any of the checks. But you can see there it's created all of our production Nagios server configuration from the playbook and the inventory file. Thank you for watching.